The silence backstage at Madison Square Garden was broken only by the distant roar of 25,000 fans chanting Whitney Houston's name, completely unaware that their idol was lying unconscious on the floor of her dressing room with white powder around her nostrils and no pulse that Tupac Shakur could detect. When he kicked down the locked door after hearing what sounded like someone falling, Tupac found America's sweetheart in a condition that would shatter the public's image of her forever. What he chose to do in the next 10 minutes would save Whitney's life, but the decision he made about how to handle the aftermath would destroy his own reputation and turn him from hip-hop hero into public enemy number one. Sometimes doing the right thing costs everything, and that night in New York would prove that no good deed goes unpunished when fame, addiction, and the media collide. It was October 15th, 1994, at Madison Square Garden during Whitney Houston's I'm Your Baby Tonight World Tour. Whitney was at the absolute peak of her commercial success, having just released the Bodyguard soundtrack, which had become the best-selling soundtrack of all time. She was America's musical royalty, the voice of a generation, and the wholesome image that parents wanted their daughters to emulate. Tupac was backstage that night not as a performer, but as a guest of Clive Davis, the legendary music executive who had discovered both artists and wanted them to collaborate on a potential duet. The meeting had been arranged in secret, as Whitney's image as clean, positive, and family-friendly was considered incompatible with Tupac's controversial persona and explicit lyrics. The contrast between the two artists couldn't have been more dramatic. Whitney represented everything that mainstream America loved about black music: sophisticated, elegant, unthreatening, and commercially successful. Tupac represented everything that made mainstream America uncomfortable: raw, political, unapologetic, and dangerously authentic. But what Tupac discovered that night would reveal that the distance between Whitney's public image and private reality was a chasm that was slowly destroying her from the inside. The evening had started routinely. Whitney had performed the first half of her show flawlessly, delivering the powerful vocals and graceful stage presence that had made her an international superstar. During the intermission, she had retreated to her dressing room while Tupac waited in the adjacent green tent area to meet with her about the potential collaboration. But as the intermission stretched longer than scheduled, people began to get worried. Whitney's assistant had knocked on her dressing room door repeatedly without getting a response. Security had tried calling her on the internal phone system with no success. Finally, Clive Davis had asked Tupac to check on her, thinking that maybe she was just nervous about meeting him and needed encouragement. When Tupac approached Whitney's dressing room, he could hear the distant sound of running water from what seemed to be a bathroom faucet. But when he knocked loudly and called her name, there was no response. Then he heard what sounded like something heavy falling to the floor, followed by complete silence. Tupac's street instincts immediately told him something was seriously wrong. Without hesitation, he kicked the dressing room door hard enough to break the lock and burst inside. What he found was a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Whitney Houston was lying unconscious on the floor next to an overturned chair. White powder was visible around her nostrils and on a small mirror that had fallen beside her. Her breathing was so shallow it was barely perceptible, and when Tupac checked for a pulse, he could barely find one. In that moment, Tupac faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could call for medical help immediately, which would save Whitney's life, but also expose her drug use to everyone backstage and ultimately to the public. Or he could try to revive her quietly and cover up what had happened, protecting her image but risking her life if his efforts failed. Most people in Tupac's position would have chosen to protect the superstar's reputation. The logical choice was to try to wake her up, clean up the evidence, and pretend nothing had happened. It was what Whitney's management team would have wanted, what the record label would have preferred, and what would have protected both of their careers. But Tupac Shakur had never been someone who chose the safe or logical path when someone's life was at stake. Without hesitation, he screamed for help while simultaneously beginning CPR on Whitney's unconscious form. Within seconds, security guards, assistants, and medical personnel came rushing into the dressing room. What they saw was Tupac performing chest compressions on an unconscious Whitney Houston, while drug paraphernalia lay scattered around the room. The paramedics who arrived within minutes confirmed what Tupac already knew: Whitney was experiencing a cocaine overdose and would have died within minutes if he hadn't found her and called for help immediately. His quick thinking and willingness to prioritize her life over her reputation had literally saved her. But the consequences of his decision were immediate and devastating. Within hours of the incident, word had leaked to the media that Whitney Houston had overdosed backstage and been found by Tupac Shakur. The story exploded across tabloid headlines, fundamentally altering public perception of both artists in ways that neither of them would ever recover from. For Whitney, the revelation of her drug use shattered the wholesome image that had been central to her commercial appeal. Despite her management team's attempts to spin the incident as exhaustion or dehydration, too many people had witnessed the reality of what had happened. Her reputation as America's sweetheart was permanently damaged. But for Tupac, the consequences were even more severe and completely unexpected. Instead of being praised for saving Whitney's life, he was vilified by both the media and the public as the person who had corrupted an innocent star. Despite the fact that he had found her already overdosed and had literally saved her life, the narrative that emerged painted him as the bad influence who had introduced Whitney to drugs. The story, as reported in tabloids and entertainment shows, suggested that Tupac had brought cocaine to Whitney's dressing room and was responsible for her overdose. No evidence supported this claim, and everyone who had been backstage knew it was false, but the narrative fit existing stereotypes about rap music and its artists. Whitney's management team, instead of defending Tupac or clarifying what had actually happened, allowed the false narrative to persist because it deflected blame from Whitney and placed it on someone whose reputation could withstand the damage better than hers could. The injustice of the situation was staggering. Tupac had literally saved Whitney's life, but he was being blamed for nearly ending it. He had chosen to prioritize her safety over both of their reputations, but he was being punished while she was being portrayed as a victim of his influence. But the worst part was yet to come. 3 days after the incident, Whitney Houston held a press conference where she was supposed to thank Tupac for saving her life and clarify what had actually happened that night. Instead, under pressure from her management team and record label, she delivered a statement that completely threw Tupac under the bus. "I want to address the rumors about what happened backstage last week," Whitney said, looking directly into the cameras with tears in her eyes. "I made a mistake by allowing myself to be influenced by people who don't share my values. I take full responsibility for my actions, but I also want young people to understand how easy it is to be led astray by the wrong crowd." The statement was carefully crafted to suggest that Tupac had been a bad influence without explicitly accusing him of providing drugs. But the implication was clear to everyone watching. Whitney was blaming Tupac for her overdose. Tupac watched the press conference from his hotel room and felt something break inside him that would never fully heal. He had saved this woman's life, and she was now destroying his reputation to protect her own. The media frenzy that followed was unprecedented. Tupac found himself being attacked not just as a rapper who glorified violence and drug use, but as someone who actively corrupted innocent people and put their lives in danger. Death threats poured in from Whitney Houston fans who believed he had tried to kill their idol. Radio stations stopped playing his music. Concert venues canceled his appearances. The false narrative became so pervasive that even people within the hip-hop community began to question whether Tupac had actually been responsible for Whitney's overdose. His attempts to tell the truth about what had happened were dismissed as self-serving lies designed to protect his reputation. But perhaps the most painful part of the entire experience was watching Whitney Houston's continued descent into drug addiction over the following years, while being unable to help her because any contact between them was now seen as evidence of his corrupting influence. Every time Whitney appeared in public looking thin, erratic, or under the influence, Tupac knew that the real story of her addiction remained untold. He knew that her drug use had predated their meeting by years, that her management team and record label had been covering it up long before he had found her unconscious in her dressing room. He knew that the pressure to maintain her perfect public image was actually making her addiction worse, not better. But he also knew that speaking publicly about any of this would only result in more attacks on his character and more damage to both of their careers. In private conversations with close friends, Tupac would sometimes talk about the Whitney incident as the moment he realized that no amount of good intentions could protect him from a media and entertainment industry that had already decided what role he was supposed to play in American culture. "I saved her life," he would say, "and they turned me into the villain. That's when I knew that the truth don't matter when people already made up their minds about who you are." The incident fundamentally changed how Tupac approached his public persona and his relationships with other artists. He became more guarded, more suspicious of media narratives, and more convinced that the entertainment industry would sacrifice anyone to protect its most valuable assets. Years later, after Whitney's death in 2012, some people who had been backstage that night at Madison Square Garden finally spoke publicly about what had actually happened. They confirmed that Tupac had indeed saved Whitney's life, that there had been no evidence he was involved in her drug use, and that the narrative blaming him had been completely fabricated. But by then, Tupac had been dead for over 15 years, and the damage to his reputation had become permanent. The true story of his heroism that night was buried under decades of false reporting and deliberate character assassination. The Madison Square Garden incident also highlighted the impossible position that black artists were put in when it came to supporting each other publicly. Whitney's decision to blame Tupac for her problems was made under enormous pressure from people who cared more about protecting her commercial value than about fairness or loyalty. The entertainment industry's willingness to sacrifice Tupac's reputation to protect Whitney's demonstrated how expendable controversial black artists were considered compared to those who maintained mainstream appeal. Music historians now view the Whitney Houston incident as a turning point in Tupac's career and public image. It marked the beginning of his transformation from rising rap star to public enemy, and it established the pattern of media coverage that would follow him for the rest of his life. The incident also became a case study in how quickly false narratives can become accepted truth when they confirm existing biases and serve the interests of powerful people. 29 years after that night at Madison Square Garden, the story of what really happened remains a powerful reminder of how heroic actions can be twisted into villainous ones when the truth threatens the wrong people. Tupac Shakur saved Whitney Houston's life and was punished for it by an industry that valued image over integrity, profit over justice, and mythology over truth. The man who kicked down a door to save a dying woman was turned into the monster who corrupted an angel, and that lie became so powerful that it outlasted both of their lives. If this story moved you too, hit that like. For more incredible stories, subscribe, and get ready for the next revelation.